Revenge of the Black Cloak Society, a King's Quest-based fic. Chapter 9, The Dark Lair. King Alexander of the Green Isles looked at the magic mirror that adorned the wall of his father's throne room. A few hours ago, his parents, King Graham and Queen Valenice of Daventry, left with his djinn, Shamir Shamazel, for Kalima. If, as they had believed, the only dark magic at work was just around Daventry, they should have been back by now. However, since they had not returned, he was worried. It also didn't help that the magic mirror remained dark. It remained a sign that something very evil was at work, and everyone was sure it was the Black Cloak Society. He shook his head and continued to pace in the room, all the time fearing the worst had happened to his parents and cousin. He quickly turned when he heard a door in the room opening. He relaxed a bit when he saw it was the historian, Cale Silver. He had asked someone to tell the historian to come to the throne room, since Crispin was currently looking into some way to get through to Kalima. He was wondering if the man knew anything about the history there. "Cale, I had asked for you to come here a while ago, and the messenger said you weren't in your quarters. What was the delay?" He watched as the historian briefly kneeled. "I am sorry, sire. I had been checking in the library for more information relating to the situation in Kalima. In fact, I believe I have confirmed some things about the tower and of Hagatha." Alexander wasn't sure if it was a good thing or not, but he walked over to his father's throne and sat down. Deep down, he figured it would be best to hear what the historian had to say while sitting down. "What have you learned, Cale? And can it help my parents in any way if we can get word to them?" He waited for a moment as the historian pulled out some papers inside. "Well, what I have found does not bode well for the situation. I found the old history of Kalima, and it seems before your mother's family arrived there, most of the land was under the grip of two ogress sorceresses, Hagatha and her younger sister, Baba Yaga. While Hagatha used her cave as her center of power, Baba worked from her moving hut. The only thing keeping them from full control of Kalima had been the Red Witch." Alexander nodded, realizing how old Hagatha was, and what that meant about her powers. He thought about that as Cale continued. "When your mother's family came to Kalima, her ancestor vowed to help rid the land of the threat the ogresses posed. It had seemed that the ogresses would abduct a child once a month, but no one knew why. During the last abduction, they managed to chase off Baba Yaga, which struck a blow to the sisters' power." Alexander rose from the throne, realizing what implications were made by that tale. "So, whatever the Black Cloak Society is doing, it is also allowing Hagatha some revenge. And with her age, most powers might not be able to penetrate the barrier she put up." He started to pace as a loud wind started to howl. As he paced, he heard Cale say, "I fear the only way to break those dark forces is to somehow get into the tower, and once night falls, nothing will get in. It may take something as fast as the wind itself to do that." For a brief moment, Alexander felt crestfallen, until he heard a new voice in the room. "Fast as the wind, like Sirocco?" He turned to face the voice, and was glad to see that it was his sister, Rosella, and her fiancé, Prince Edgar. The sight of those two being there at that moment gave Alexander hope that something was about to happen for the better. Prince Edgar remained quiet for a moment as he watched a happy reunion between his fiancée and her brother. With all that appeared to be going on right now, a momentary happiness was needed. He looked around the room as Rosella spoke to her brother. "Brother, it's good to see you in Daventry. I trust all is well in the Green Isles right now?" He watched momentarily as Alexander shrugged. "'Tis as good as one should expect. However, I fear something evil may be coming there soon, since Daventry and now Kalima have fallen prey to a very dark evil." For a moment, just as his future brother-in-law said that, Edgar's gaze fell on the other man in the room. He wasn't sure why, but the man seemed out of place. That could be that it had been some time since he was in Daventry. However, he put that out of his mind as he figured it was time to get down to why they had arrived in Daventry. "Alexander, I wish we could have said this was just a visit. However, Rosella received a message from your father and mother not too long ago." He noticed a look of relief briefly cross Alexander before it disappeared again. "I do hope it was good news when you heard from them. However, I do doubt it." He wasn't sure if Alexander knew the nature of their visit or not, but at this point something had to be said. Before he said a word, however, he noticed Rosella looking at the other man in the room, before finally speaking in an authoritative tone. "And who are you? Are you the historian that my father wrote about?" As the man nodded, Edgar could have sworn he saw the man's face before, many years ago, when he was under the spell of Lalot. However, he realized the man couldn't have been the same as that man. This man was obviously younger. Even the voice was different as the man spoke. "Yes, your highness, I am Cale Silva. Your father and brother have been asking my help on the current matters. I must admit that I had to do some research, especially into the quartz tower." Edgar remembered what they had been told by the fairy, and then a thought hit him. "Alexander, Rosella, did your parents ever tell you how they got to the island?" It was his beloved who answered first. "I heard the story a lot growing up. My father had to unlock this door, which gave him access to a beach on the east side of Kalima, and then he had to sail to the island. Given how much time is left until its evil purpose that the fairy told us, they may not make it in time." Before he could mention his idea, feeling certain it would work, he heard the historian speak up. "If they get past Hagatha, they might have a chance, but getting out might be the problem. Hagatha won't go near the tower now. It seems the tower would be destroyed if a large source of dark magic would be stuck in it when it did its deed." After hearing those words, Edgar knew his plan would work. He looked at Rosella and Alexander and spoke. "I have an idea. However, we will need to head back to Eldritch and to King Otar. He has something we can use to stop Hagatha. Once we have the item, I'll quickly explain my plan." He was stunned when Alexander shook his head. I'm afraid I'll have to remain here for now. It would not be right to leave Daventry without a ruler right now. I trust you have a good plan." Edgar nodded. He was certain his plan would work, especially as he revised it to include eliminating the tower so it could never be used again. If all goes right, the threat of the tower, as well as Hagatha, will never be over Kalima again. He then turned to leave, with Rosella following him. He knew she would back him up on his plan, and was also eager to learn the plan, but he knew they needed to move and act at the same time, as the day got later and later. Some time had passed since Scarlet witnessed the message that King Graham had passed to the fairy that helped protect Kalima. Since then, the only thing that she had noticed was an odd wind. She wasn't sure what the odd wind stood for, but part of her felt it couldn't be good. She had remained up in the monastery tower after the message had been delivered, mainly to watch for any problems. With the sky darkening more and more, she was sure that Hagatha was using some very dark magic. At first, she thought the foul ogress was just creating huge dark clouds. However, she started to think otherwise as stars started to appear in the sky. She then headed down to the church part of the monastery. When she reached it, she saw that King Graham and Queen Valenice were obviously planning their next move. When they looked up at her as she approached, she told what she had seen. There have been no signs of any attack coming. However, there has been an odd wind, and even though not much time has passed, stars are showing in the sky. I fear that Hagatha is trying to speed up the passage of time in Kalima. You may not have long to stop her. She felt a little at ease when Valenice looked at her and smiled. The odd wind you heard must have been Sirocco. That means Rosella has received our message. Then the look on Valenice's face changed to one of worry. But will she be able to help in time if Hagatha is doing as you claim? She watched as Graham shrugged. I don't know if she will get here in time or not. What we may have to do is attempt to get to the island on the poisoned lake and get to the doors before the night ends. She then watched as he turned to face her. Do you think you have a protection spell that will keep us safe until we get to and through the magic door? Scarlet thought for a moment and then nodded. I do have one, and it should keep us all invisible to the senses of Hagatha and her minions. However, the only trick will be getting you across the lake. The ferryman will not see you, but can sense spirits and things unseen, since it is his nature. If you have some treasure that could get you across. She was stunned when Valenice removed her earrings. Before she could even consider asking her to reconsider, she heard Valenice say why. These earrings were given to me by my father. After hearing of how he really was, I'd rather not have them any more. At least they can be put to a truly good use in helping to rescue my niece. She watched as King Graham nodded and then said, That should cover the fee, especially if the ferryman can't see us. If you can cast the spell now, we'll rush to the ferryman's location. He might just sense two spirits and accept the mysterious fee to get them across. Scarlet nodded and raised her arms in the air. Soon a glow emanated from her hands and filled the monastery. As quickly as it started, it disappeared, and she felt the spell was working. She then headed for the door and opened it. It is done. Now we must rush. If time is truly passing quickly, this night might not last very long at all. She watched as Graham and Valenice nodded, and they rushed out of the monastery. Outside, the darkness of night coated the land, and even she could feel the malevolence in the air. It was as if the forces of darkness knew that Kalima was about to fall, and were preparing to accept it. As they reached and ran along the edge of the poisoned lake, Scarlet noticed some movement in the woods around the lake. A quick glance let her see the thieving gnome running about, as well as the sorcerer. Judging by their movement, she could swear they were searching for someone instead of random victims. She was again glad the spell was working, and kept them all hidden from view. When they finally reached the location of the ferryman, She was glad to see the shade was waiting. They stopped for a moment, and King Graham looked at her. "Thank you for helping us get this far. If you can, rush back to the castle. They may need some help there." She nodded, then watched as both Graham and Valenice entered the boat. As they did, she saw the ferryman hold out a withered hand, and Valenice placed the earrings in it. Soon the boat started crossing the poisoned lake. She waited for a moment and started to move towards the royal castle. Just as she started to move, she was stunned to find that she stopped moving. She tried again to move, but couldn't. She was puzzled by this until a voice said, "Well, the famous Red Witch of Kalima is stuck. It seems her powers are fading and will soon be no more." She tried to turn her head but couldn't. However, she realized she didn't need to find out who had done this to her. She already knew. And what she wanted to know was how they could have done it. Before she could voice the question, she felt hands feeling along her body, searching for pockets. Finally, the voice of the gnome was heard, and he said, "A shame she doesn't have any pockets. I could have added to my collection before Hagatha plans to kill her." The sorcerer then walked into her view and sneered, "I think she won't kill her just yet. I'm sure Hagatha wants her to live long enough to see the last of good and Kalima get snuffed out." She then heard the evildoers laugh, especially as she realized her magic spell never worked in the first place, and that King Graham and Queen Valenice were truly walking into a trap. King Graham sat silently next to his wife as the ferryman continued to get them across the poisoned lake. He didn't want to risk saying a word, lest their magical cover be blown. He was not sure if the mysterious ferryman was a servant of Hagatha, or just a figure that appeared in Kalima and only aided the vampire to and from his home. He decided to stop thinking about that, and how they would handle what was sure to be the riskiest part of the plan. He had figured that the only place Hagatha would take the magical doors was to the island castle, and most likely the basement. Hopefully, with the protection of the magic spell, they would be safe. He glanced back towards the far shore, and didn't see any trace of Scarlet. Of course, he hoped that she was heading back to the castle to help the people there. He was sure that with all that was happening, the werewolves would be trying something at the castle, and they would need all the help they could get. He was brought out of his thoughts when the boat reached the shore. He didn't say a word as both he and his wife left the ferry. He didn't speak until they took a few steps away from the ferry. "We may need to be extra careful right now. All the brambles along this path are poisonous. I remember that from my first time here. We may have a break since I don't see any of the ghostly guards." He watched as Valenice nodded, and they started along the path. He remembered that the path wasn't long, but took time to be sure they were avoiding every poisonous branch that stuck out into the path. As they walked, he heard his wife say, "I hope we will have enough time to find the magic door." As they neared the castle door, he responded to his wife's statement. "We will. I'm sure that the door is in the basement. We should get by unnoticed, thanks to Scarlet's spell, but it would be better if we don't waste time. We take the direct route down and move quickly." When they reached the door, his wife looked at the door and said, "Let's just hope the spell doesn't fail and we can get to the door quickly. Given how the dark magic is speeding up the passage of time, any delay would be disastrous." He nodded and started to open the door as she continued. I do fear that if we get caught, it will be very bad not only for Kalima, but for Daventry as well. He nodded, and they quickly entered the old castle. Once they were inside, he quickly closed the door and remained silent for a moment. They were in the lair of a powerful evil force, and with no aid, stealth had to be their weapon. When he was sure that no one moved, he motioned in the direction he had gone years before. They quickly passed through a dining room, with no sign of any of the evil forces. He knew there weren't many rooms in the small castle, not that a vampire needed them, but that also meant very little hiding spots. Inwardly, he was hoping they were all part of a move on his in-laws' castle. While that might not be good for them there, it would allow Valenice and him to get to the magic door unnoticed. When they reached the top of the stairs that descended to the basement, he wanted to breathe a sigh of relief. He felt they were very close to the magic door that would take them to the eastern part of Kalima, where the quartz tower was. Then the next race would be to get to the tower in time. He had been hoping that something would be there to help them reach his niece, but first thing was to get to the door. As they neared the bottom of the old, winding stairs, he felt better about events as he saw the door, and no apparent guards. However, as he motioned to his wife to head towards their goal, something nagged at him, saying this was just too easy. Agatha smiled as she saw her prey enter the lower levels of the castle. As she figured, they would come to the castle, knowing it was the place she hid the door. What they were unaware of was that the real door was actually in the next room, and that the door they saw was just a decoy. It was all part of her plan. When Shadrach had contacted her, she had only to adjust her plan that she was going to set into motion. She had already set things up to arrange the capture of Princess Yvette and the death of Scarlet, or, if the werewolves had failed, her capture. Now the majority of the werewolves were preparing to attack the castle. In fact, the attack was supposed to happen when the quartz tower did its evil task. Now everything was in place for the final part of the plan, as she was sure Shadrach would be proud. Her plan had started with one kingdom, but now she could bring down Daventry as well, which had become a major thorn in the Black Cloak society. She even had a fiendish way of doing it. She would send one of them back once they were transformed, under an illusion spell. She stopped musing on her plans when King Graham and Queen Valenice reached the bottom of the steps and moved towards the door. That meant that soon it would be time to strike. She had to make sure there was no way for them to escape. Once they were close enough, she'd put the final phase of her plan into action. She waited for a moment as Graham said, I haven't heard anything yet, but let's hope if an attack does come that we are entering the door at that time. She then watched as he started to reach for the door. She knew now was the perfect moment for her forces to strike. In an instant she dropped the illusion of the door, as well as the illusion hiding her and her minions from view. In that instant she saw shock on both her captives' faces. She then made the stairs into a slick slope that nothing could climb. She pointed at them and shouted, Seize them! At that moment the vampire quickly glided over, and in an instant had captured Valenice, and was poised to bite her. She also watched as the werewolf pounced so quickly that it pinned Graham to the floor, and was almost ready to rip the king's neck out. However, she noticed that there was still a bit of defiance in the two captives. This was evident when Valenice spoke. "How did you know we were here?" She cackled and walked over to the beautiful queen. "Very simple, Valenice. The spell that Scarlet had cast never concealed you at all." When the two had gasped, she knew it was a shock to them. "In fact, after the ferryman brought you over here, my minions had captured Scarlet. The only thing keeping her alive is that I want you all to see your failure." With the werewolf on top of him, she could see that Graham wasn't worried about what would happen to him, but still was worried about others. "You haven't succeeded yet. You will be stopped. Our family will seek us out when we don't return." She glanced at Graham and for a brief moment thought about placing him in her cooking pot. However, her plans called for him to stay alive, at least in body. "They won't. You see, once the quartz tower does its job, I'll have my werewolf bite you, and then you will turn your whole kingdom into my servants. Your kingdom will fall, and Shadrach will be pleased." In that moment she saw a genuine look of fear cross her two captives' faces. It was the sign she needed to prove to her that her plan would soon succeed. The fact that the winds got louder also told her that even nature in Kalima was starting to bend to the will of the Black Cloak Society. Deep down, she felt certain that this would be the end of both Kalima and Daventry.